Good morning. Okay, let's get the door mostly closed. Let's get started. It's very difficult to end a course. It's much easier to begin. Trying to find a way in an hour or an hour and 15 minutes to summarize everything that we've covered is not easy. But in some ways, I'm going to try to go back to the beginning, pull it all together, and try to make sense out of it. Everybody good with that? Okay. This poem was written by Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the philosopher who proclaimed the death of God. He's also my intellectual great-grandfather. And everything I do is in some shape or form shaped by Nietzsche. So let's go through this poem together. It's called To an Unknown God. Once again, lest I withdraw more distant and turn my eyes onward. In loneliness I turn my hands upward, to you to whom I retreat, to whom I have solemnly consecrated altars in the deepest, most intimate embrace. For your voice has always called to me in turn. Thereupon does the deeply written phrase glow, to an unknown God. It is I, though I am still left in the outrage of the herd. It is I, and I feel the traps which pull me down struggling, and I wish to flee. Yet I compel myself to a more delicate situation, a desire to know you, you who are unknown, you who put your hands deep into my soul, you who wander through my life like a storm, you who are incomprehensible, you who are kin to me. I desire to know you as you know yourself. So let's start there. No one teaches in a vacuum. And any professor who tells you that he or she teaches completely objectively is not being forthcoming with themselves. I am as much a product of my life as I am the material that I've studied. And one of the struggles that I have been facing my entire life is whether or not in the end I can acclaim the existence of God. And part of the problem is William of Ockham was known for what became called Occam's razor, the simplest solution is always the best. So putting this class in more autobiographical terms, when I read the Iliad and the Odyssey at 7, that began a process by which Occam's razor became an indispensable tool with which I began to approach everything that I studied. By the time I was 8, I had discovered that the myth of the flood was present in every ancient religion. In one of the turning points of my life, I confronted my father and said, if the story of the flood exists in all of these religions, then how can we possibly believe that the Bible is true? And my father did not have an answer. By the time that I was 16, I walked away from science. I was working in the labs at Yale at the time. And I came to realize that the promise of science is inherently flawed. That in the end, the motivation behind science and the motivation behind religion are the same. And this takes us back to a comment I made a few days ago. Humans refuse to live in a world without certainty, without truth, without order, without structure, without meaning. I don't know what prompted it, but I was 18 years old. I was in college or finishing up. And I remember sitting down one day and coming to the conclusion that there was no incarnation, that the death of God on the cross made no sense. The only way I could wrap my head around what happened was to look for the human face of Jesus. And by the time I was 20, it was all gone. No soul, no immortality. This is it. At the same time, I discovered at the end of Albert Camus' book, The Rebel, a statement that has become the foundation for the way that I live my life. He said, there is but one rule in the modern world, and that rule is to learn to live and die. As a human being, in order to refuse to be a god. If you think seriously about what Camus said, then the most important word is human. And I realized that my entire life had come down to one question. There is but one rule in the modern world, and that rule is to learn to live and die as a human being in order to refuse to be a god. Which took me all the way back to Homer. What does it mean to be human? Any questions so far? Okay, let's look at that. I want to come at that question from a different perspective. Everyone in here was in some shape or form raised or exposed to Christianity. Am I correct? And all of you, in one way or the other, either identify as Christian or acknowledge those roots. So let's go back. When we talked about the death of Jesus, we said that there were fundamentally three options. One was that he was the wrong Messiah. The third option, I'm going to reframe. You may remember we talked about Edward Skillebeck's. And Skillebeck's argument is that the death of Jesus is the last prophetic sign. And I would argue, based upon Skillebeck's, that sign is not just the death, it's the cry on the cross. My God, why have you deserted? Why have you abandoned? Why have you forsaken? Why have you turned around, turned away? Why have you left me here to die? Paul answered that question for God. And part of what I've been arguing since I was 20 was that Paul was wrong. The point is that the cry on the cross can only be answered by God. We do not know what God's silence means. Is God dead? Does God not care? Or even more problematically, is that what God wanted? And here we come back to a theme that we see in many of the religions that we've talked about, in some shape or form, more powerful in some, weaker in others, but it still comes down to the fundamental problem of theodicy. How do we live in a world in which all that is human dies and still believe in God? Can we? Or do we simply walk away? The fundamental problem in all forms of theodicy lies between the dichotomy of God as our murderer and God as impotent. Aside from all of the problems I have with Paul theologically, for me it comes down to we cannot answer the question which is not ours to answer. The cry on the cross is unanswered. 2022 years of silence. How do we live in a world in which all that is human dies? Ultimately, when I wrote my dissertation, the position I advocated I called protest theism. Protest theism comes down to this. The cry on the cross remains unanswered. I choose in the face of ambiguity. In the face of the possibility that God is either my murderer or God is impotent. To love God anyway. I let the question be. I stand in the silence.
So protest theism just accepting when you cannot answer?
That's right. I take responsibility. For the world. For those of you who have had me in philosophy or have engaged me in other conversations, then you probably already know where this goes. The answer to the human question, the answer to the silence of God, is to love in a world in which all that is human dies. Not because it is required by a God, but because it is the human and humane thing to do. Camus talks about the confrontation with the absurd. He says that humans demand meaning. As we've said, humans do not wish to live in a world without truth, without certainty, and without meaning. Our demand for meaning is met with silence. If God is there, God does not speak. The universe doesn't care. The universe doesn't know. We are irrelevant. We have two choices: despair and denial, or love. In life negative cultures, the answer is always despair and denial. The answer is always truth. The answer is always some form of immortality. The answer is always some form of human guilt. The answer is always oppressive gods. The answer is humans manipulate gods in the face of certain destruction. But love doesn't know manipulation. Love does not need certainty. Love does not need truth. Love is its own meaning. When I love in a world in which all that is human dies, I am most human. When I pursue truth at the cost of love, I lose my humanity. So if you think about all the religions that we've studied this semester, they repeat the same pattern because they begin at the same point. At some point, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago, one of our ancestors stood up somewhere in Africa. And at that moment, our confrontation with death, the paradox of being a part of and apart from the universe, became a part of our world. And as we said back at the beginning of the class, there are basically three ways in which we respond to that. Life negative culture, life neutral, or life affirmative. In a life negative culture, death is feared. The unknown is feared. People who don't look like us are feared. Women are not valued the way men are valued. And we see where that takes us. We do not, by definition, have to live in the world in which we live. The mistake we make is that we accept this as the way it must be. The mistake is that we confuse nature and nurture. I was thinking over the last few days how it was possible for me to survive the childhood I had. It came down to the fact that in the face of certain death on the farm, my grandfather was able to convince me that if I changed the way that I saw the world, I would walk off the farm. So as much as this class has called into account the patterns in all the religions of the world that have taken us to where we are, I hope it inspires you to fundamentally change the way you behave and the way you see the world. Because what it comes down to is that we can replace fear, as Joseph Campbell said, with awe. We can transform fear into compassion, into care, into kindness, into love. If we build a society that's predicated on what's common to us as humans, then all those things that separate us no longer matter. What matters only is that we were all born and will die. What we choose to do between birth and death is what defines our humanity. We are what we do. We become what we choose. So if you take nothing away from this class, I urge you to question everything you have ever been told. Don't accept anything as true. Turn your view of the world upside down. When I started in photography in October of 2002, before I turned pro, late one afternoon in October, I was sitting in the sunroom in the house, and the sky turned an absolutely brilliant gold color. I jumped in my redneck friend's truck and took off after the sunset. If you can imagine that I had never even paid attention to the golden hour. When I got done, I picked up my laptop, I drove up to Law, North Carolina, woke up my redneck friend, showed him my photos, and said, by the way, I'm never going to tell anyone what I found. And his comment back to me was, how did you live this long and never see the golden hour? And by the way, there's nothing that you can photograph that someone else has not already photographed. What matters is how you see the world. So when you walk out of here today, how will you see the world? Are you going to continue to accept everything that you've been told is true? Or will you have the courage to question? Meaningful change is possible, but it's not going to come through law, constitutional amendment, or a corrupt Supreme Court. The world is changed for better or worse, one life at a time. Are you going to be part of the change, or will you continue to accept the status quo? The history of the human species is a history of violence and destruction and war and rape and crime and murder because we continue to allow that to be the case. Because life-negative cultures are malignant and cancerous. It's time to go back and ask the question again. What does it mean to be human in a world in which all that is human dies? And after thousands of books and hundreds of classes and decades teaching, I keep coming back to the same question. And the answer doesn't change. I am most human. Not when I'm believing in God, not when I'm down on my knees, not when I conform to doctrine. I'm most human when I love in a world in which all that is human dies. Before I move on, questions, comments, thoughts? Is this helping bring it together? Yes. Okay, a life neutral culture internally is life affirmative. When they're threatened, they become life negative. The Apache. So think about it this way. If we became a life affirmative culture in a world dominated by life negative cultures, what do you think would happen to us? We would be obliterated. But we can build a life affirmative culture within our borders. We can have an educational system that works for everyone. Yes.
I don't make you feel like I understand this, and I understand where you're going, and I understand how you did it. But like you said, it's really hard to one challenge people's beliefs, but also get them to understand that they need to challenge their own.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay, try it this way. Every now and again, I get a blistering note back from a student. I could react the way a traditional professor would react, blow the student out of the water. I don't do that. I have tried throughout the course of the semester to create an environment where at any time any one of you could walk up to me and ask if we could talk. And those of you who have, and those of you who have had me multiple times, know that under my stern exterior, I'm very kind and caring. I got a call when I was at the gym about 3 months ago from a kid I taught 25 years ago. He'd spent the last 5 years looking for me just to say thank you. If you forget everything I have taught you, hopefully, the kindness, the care, the concern, the willingness to try to meet you where you are will carry you forward. In the end, education is about becoming human, not stuffing your head full of knowledge. It is not easy for me to talk about my past, but if I'm to relate to you as humans, then you also have to see my humanity. I don't check my humanity at the door. Other questions or comments? If you look at all of the founders of the religions, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, we can say one way or another, they had a vision. And even in the case of those religions where we don't know where the founder lived or who the founder was, they all have a vision which ultimately is tied to an answer to the human question. And as we've seen, all of the religions we've talked about, in the end, they come down on the life negative side. What if we don't come down there? What if we choose a different answer to the question? So think about it in these terms. Every revolution in the history of the world, whether that revolution is religious, political, ideological, philosophical, for better or for worse, began with one person who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. See the world again. For the first time. If you decide to re-envision your life and you decide to re-envision your world, not in terms of a life negative culture, but what we know about a life affirmative culture, what do you think your impact will be? Do you need God for that? No. Does belief in God matter? No. Does race or gender or sexuality or political beliefs matter? No. Every time someone intervened to save my life, they did so simply and solely because I was human. And because of those people, I'm here today. Remember, at 7, I was told this is what will happen. You will die on this farm. You will never walk away. Obviously, I did. So particularly at a time when we face political and social uncertainty, the old ways don't work. Political and other revolutions end up with people dead. And if you study the history of revolutions, they perpetuate the very societies they're designed to overthrow. Because underneath it, they don't fix the fundamental problem. They keep the same definition of what it means to be human. Time to change that definition. For however many millennia our species has walked the earth, life negative cultures have replaced each other with the same malignant, toxic, aggressive, destructive patterns of behavior. Enough. Enough. When we talk about certainty and truth, we better get out the shovels to dig the graves because people will end up dead. That's how it always goes. Look at any of the religions we've studied that are life negative and tell me people have not ended up dead. They do. How do we stop it? In part by letting go of truth, of certainty. We have to learn to live in an ambiguous world. A world without a center, a world without truth, except for death. Yes?
Even though they are like in a lot of the African cultures where came from ancient, humans are the center of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be important to adopt in an ambiguous world because the only constant that we have is death and life.
Right. And if you remember our discussion of Comte, correct? The 3 stages in the development of religion. Monotheism becomes the bridge to a kind of metaphysical religion. And remember, at the end, his point was a religion of humanity. Remember, he called it positivism. Well, remember also, we said that Brazil, in theory, organized itself on the principles of positivism. Well, if you know anything about Brazil, is it a fair and equal society? Are all Brazilians treated with dignity and respect and kindness? No. Why? Because in a life negative world, in a life negative paradigm, there is no equality, there is no justice. Some people are inherently better than others. Women are objectified, and everyone who doesn't look like us doesn't deserve to be treated as though they're human. So Comte was right and Comte was wrong. Think about Joseph Campbell. One of the functions of myth, as we said, is to replace fear with a sense of awe. Another is to give ourselves a sense of how we fit into the universe. Not all awe is born in reverence and a sense of connectivity. In a life negative culture, that sense of awe is riddled with distrust. It doesn't end the fear, it magnifies the fear. We feel a need to control it, not to be a part of it. So another theme that we talked about repeatedly throughout the semester comes from Erich Fromm. This applies to every aspect of who we are. And when we swing too far to one extreme or the other, we end up in trouble. And right now, we live in a world in which all we think about is the ways in which we're apart from. So we're selfish, we're narcissistic. If it's true for me, it's true. And if I don't want to hear what you have to say, then I don't. If you have anything to say to me at all. I spend my entire life trying to figure out who I am because I have cut off all my social connections. I'm a radical individual, and then I wonder why when I'm dying, I still don't know who I am. As we said earlier in the course, Darwin was right, but Darwin was wrong. The end of human evolution is not the city, not the nation state. The end of human evolution is the tribe. Without a sense of tribe, we are fundamentally broken. We have no way of knowing who we are. The a part of is left neglected. We've been headed down this path for 400 years. And we continue to think we can fix it by passing another law. We continue to think that if we define the world in terms of the ways in which we're all different, we're going to fix it. When I look at you and I see only the ways in which you're not like me, I cut off communication. I cut off the connection. I reinforce the separateness, the distinctiveness. It's easy to objectify you. In all the religions that we've studied, they come down on one extreme or the other. In Buddhism, it's all about me. And the original forms of Christianity and Judaism, Islam, was all about the community. But all the major religions of the world now are shifting towards the radical individual. And that is the fastest way to lose any sense of who we are. Questions so far? Thoughts? Is this helping? Quincy, what are you thinking today?
Kind of thinking like, now I know how like living in like a light negative culture, but it's like so hard to like see like how that can turn into something like perfect. You know, like in the world that we live in, you know, with the war, with poverty, you know, with the way that the world forces us to move and think, I think it's just, you know, hard to think of it.
Well, it is. But remember, let's go back to another conversation we had about Freud. Freud's argument was that the superego, inculcated in us by our parents, becomes our conscience. And more than that, what happens to you in the first 8 years of your life will shape how you see the world. Every aspect of it. So we still talk about free will when free will does not exist. We still begin with the assumption that original sin is right. I don't see any empirical proof that original sin exists. So if you think about what's happening, then the superego becomes a kind of programming. We are taught what to expect. We are taught how to see the world. We're taught that women need to be objectified, and if you're a woman, you're taught that you need to objectify yourself. I was having a conversation with my office mate, and the question we were talking about was, can words be reappropriated? Can we reappropriate the word race? No, we cannot. Because inherent in that word, and inescapable in that word, is the belief that we're all competing for scarce resources. It implies and will always imply survival of the fittest. Yes.
In one of my political science classes, our teacher was saying that people think about liberties as cost.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if I get a slice of pie, then that means that there's less pie for other people. But that's not how it goes at all.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I have freedom does not mean that you don't have freedom.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember Thomas Malthus and our conversation about Malthus? Okay, by way of review, Malthus said that there is an inherent relationship between population and food, such that inevitably we will have to choose. Who eats and who doesn't. Malthus was wrong. Malthus was not even a scientist. He was a preacher. No one questioned Malthus's analysis. So look at the country we live in now and tell me that we're not behaving as though Malthus were right. We don't spend the same amount of money on inner city schools because people in inner city schools are not deserving of it. If you educate them, you're taking the resources away from the people who truly deserve it. When you read in the 19th century the work of people like Spencer and Ward, their ideas are very clear. Humans are responsible for natural selection, not evolution. We have to decide who amongst us is the fittest, who deserves the scarce resources. No one ever questioned that analysis. In one of the most racist articles I ever read by Alfred Wallace, at the end, no one questioned his conclusion. They only argued about the logic. If I accepted what my parents told me, which is that Latin children die on farms, I would have been dead before I turned 18. For reasons I don't understand, I refuse to accept that. And if you push Malthus and Spencer and Ward far enough back, you end up at Aristotle. And Aristotle firmly believed that poor women needed to not have children past 2. He believed in forcing sterilization if they did. He believed in mandatory abortions. He believed in taking children considered deformed outside the city to leave them to die. He believed if you were not Athenian, you were not human. If you were Greek, to some extent you were. And if you weren't Greek, you were not human. Look at our world and tell me that we're not thinking about the world the way Aristotle did almost 3,000 years ago. We repeat the same patterns over and over. The Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. It did not make people of color equal. Does this make sense? Other questions so far? Every day, with everything you do, you are shaping the future. You are shaping yourself. You are shaping what the world will be like. If you continue to conform to what you've been taught, you will perpetuate a world of hate, manipulation, narcissism, selfishness. A world in which God becomes the ultimate truth and the reason why we enslave and murder and kill. Or perhaps Nietzsche was right. Perhaps only when God is dead are we truly free to be human. Can we do that? Can we learn to live in a world without certainty and truth? Where the common, I'm sorry?
I mean, that's the one that you do what?
Yeah. Remember Blaise Pascal from philosophy? More than anything else, humans long to be happy. Since humans die, humans can't be happy. So we fool ourselves into thinking we live forever so we can be happy. Powerful words. We could just as easily say that humans can't live in a world without certainty and truth. So in order to be happy, we invent certainty and truth. And if people get abused and killed and treated poorly, that's okay. The Bible said it, I believe it, that settles it. The Quran said it, I believe it, that settles it. Substitute the religious document of your choice. I believe it, that settles it. I would like you to think that today is really the beginning of the next phase of this class. And that phase is, what will you do to take what you have learned here today and change the world one life at a time? If you look back on this class in 10 years, how many lives will you have touched for the better? I leave you with two thoughts. His name was Francis of Assisi. He left what is called the prayer for peace. I omit the references to the divine because I don't do it for God's sake. I do it for human sake. Make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is doubt, faith, despair, hope, darkness, light, and sadness, joy. Grant so much that I do not seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, and to be loved as to love. For when I give, I receive. When I pardon, I am pardoned. Carry those words forward. So, the last thing I have to say before I let you go. As long as I am alive, I will be your teacher. I will be there for you whenever and however you need me. We're done. Take care. If you have any questions, you can stick around.